Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Welcome back to the Prime Property Finance Podcast. Here's part 2 of the top 10 things to consider before buying your first investment property. Let's dive straight in and we hope you enjoy. So let's move now on to sort of what we probably section 2 of the considerations of things to do before you buy your first property, and that's more around the deal analysis. If we talk about one of the first types of conversations that we would have, so this would be point number 5 on the list, would be around deposit and loan to values and sort of how much money do you need for your first deal?
Yeah, so it ties perfectly back to point 2, which was personal circumstances. So how much cash have you got available to you? As I say, just to reinfer, we are talking about property ownership here, which is you will need capital. There are other strategies outside of property ownership that you can get into and so on. But for this purposes of this episode, you're going to own the property. So deposit and loan to values. So firstly, what is a loan to value? A loan to value is literally the percentage of the property value the lender is prepared to lend to you. Now, typically in the buy-to-let space, it's 75%. Okay, there are loans out there which you can do 80, 85% in some instances, but the rates reflect that. So many borrowers sit at the 75%, and that's the most common deposit that we talk about. So 25% typically is what you're going to require as a deposit. It's important to remember in property, it's not just the deposit. There are other costs associated to the purchase. So there are transaction costs, maybe subject to stamp duty. Okay. Now, we don't talk too much about stamp duty. The reason being is that's very property specific, and you need, again, to get the required advice from the legal professionals to steer you down that road. But some properties will and won't be subject to stamp duty or land transaction tax if you're in Wales. Holding costs. So if you're not going to get that property occupied straight away, so you might be doing a heavy refurb or a light refurb even, you may have the utilities. You brought up an interesting point before this around council tax. So vacant properties attracting double council tax. If that's already been utilised by the previous owner, then you may have to pay double council tax whilst you're doing the work on the property. The valuation costs, solicitor fees, our fees, so we've got to make sure they're paid on that. So yeah, these are all additional costs. So 25% is your starting number. You then need to allocate spend, of course, for the rest of the transaction costs. Even if it's just a turnkey buy-to-let that nothing needs touching, it's brand spanking new, it's ready to be inhabited by a tenant. Invariably, whilst there is massive demand for homes currently, there is a period that you've got to list the property, market the property for, do your tenant checks. They're not going to turn up on day 2, day after completion with all the sofas and everything ready to move into it. It's not going to happen. There is a period of time that's not going to generate income. So all of that needs to get taken into consideration when we talk about how much money you've got available for the project you're talking about.
And oftentimes people will say, right, I've got my 25% deposit, right, great. And then you say, do you still have you got surplus cash? Is that 25%, is that the total amount of money that you have? Or do you have extra money on top of that for your stamp duty, your solicitor's fees, your refurb? There's very few properties that you buy which don't need any bit of work, even if it's a lick of paint, or something along those lines. So Yeah, and people often overlook those additional costs, and so it's really when you're getting into your deal analysis, is looking at, right, how much am I going to need for this? If this once you know your strategy, this is the type of property I'm going to want. This is how much I need for a deposit, but also these are all the additional costs that I'm going to incur in order to buy that property.
Yeah, absolutely. And like stamp duty, for example, is paid within 30 days of completion. So you can't wait and then accrue, and build up the set. You've got to get it paid. So it needs to be in the bank.
Solicitors will take it off you before completion because they'll pay it to HMRC, so yeah. Okay. And obviously there are scenarios where you might find a property that's uninhabitable, or various things, or you might be buying multiple properties in one transaction. There's a number of reasons why stamp duty you may not pay stamp duty. If it's an additional home, if you already own the property, then you pay the additional rate of stamp duty. So there's a number of considerations, and we'll probably go into that in a lot more detail. But just do be careful that you are paying the correct stamp duty, because that can come back and bite you, as some people in government have found out recently.
Indeed.
So, okay, that's enough about deposits and loan to values. Obviously, the higher the deposit you have, the lower the loan to value, the better the interest rate you're generally going to get, because the lenders, it's risk based, and so there's less risk of them not getting their money back. So if you do have lots of cash, then putting a bigger deposit down will get you a better interest rate, and then will get you better cash flow. So again, depends on your circumstances.
Could I caveat that as well? Because that is a great point, and something that we get asked a lot about. I can put 35% down and so on. This comes back to strategy. So if your strategy is that I want to own more than one property, whilst you might save, I don't know, making this up, 0.5% for going from 75% per annum, this is 0.5% per annum from 75% down to 65%, that may mean an additional £20,000, say, of cash into that. Your plan is to build more properties, then is that 0.5% saving worth getting versus the opportunity cost that you're not going to have that cash available to go into the next property? So again, these questions are never quite that straightforward. I actually sound like a politician now, but they're never as straightforward as a yes or no answer, depending on how the conversation's gone at the front end. So it's weighing up that, is that 0.5% worth saving, or am I better off having the cash for £20,000, which gets me 20 metres down the track to go and buy the next one?
And I think that reminds me of a question, is another one that we're asked all the time is this a good deal?
Depends.
Yeah.
There we go. People are having a bit of an insight into our conversations now, and it depends.
and that's it. Again, and I know we've touched on this in previous episodes, but just to labour the point a little bit, what is a good deal for me and a good deal for you are two very different things. One of my best mates is a GP or doctor, and he's got cash that he builds up, and he's got some cash. He doesn't want to have too much involvement, but he has a very clear return on his cash that he would like to generate. So he can afford to pay a little bit more or have a very light refurb. So he wants to add value, of course, because he still wants to recycle his cash, but his return on cash compared to maybe somebody else who doesn't have any of their own cash and is using investor funds, and they need to repay that, they might not need to get as close to all of their money out of a deal and recycle that cash as much as possible. Those are two very different transactions. This is a lot lighter in terms of involvement. This is a lot more heavy refurb and things. So those are two, and he could be, maybe go and buy a new build property and just leave the money in there. It's a long-term asset play, which is very different to that. So again, goes back to strategy. Is this a good deal? Is it a good deal for you? It might be a good deal for you, but it might not be a good deal for me.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't mean that it's not a good deal.
No, exactly. And, so where we look at these two things, property can do two jobs. Well, it can do more than two jobs, but they tend to fall into two camps. Property is a very good store of wealth, which is what you refer to there, where my personal circumstances, I've got a good job, I'm earning X hundred of thousands of pounds, and I just need somewhere to park my money that is not cash, that is not stocks and shares, or I want to complement what I've already got type thing. That's a store of wealth. Whereas property then, as a wealth generation tool, is quite different. There's a very different strategy. It isn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a very much slow burn. You're not going to be a millionaire overnight type thing, whereas you might be in crypto, for example. If you want to be a millionaire overnight, go and do something that's higher risk. Property is quite steady Eddie.
By the way, do not go and spend all your money. don't go and invest all your money in crypto. That is not advice.
That is not advice at all. Don't follow me on crypto, for goodness sake. Follow me if you know what to not do anyway. So yeah, and that's the point then, is so store of wealth versus wealth generation. It's a tool that can be used for both. We come back to personal circumstances, objectives, and all of the usual
and it's
stuff.
Active. It's a business for one.
Yeah.
So you'll get a property now. A property in portfolio is a business. You have to treat it like a business. All the rules that have come in from the government in terms of increasing the standard of homes, energy efficiency, tenancy management, contracts, admin, all of that is making you be a business. So if you don't want to run a business on the side, then property investment isn't for you, effectively. Those days are long gone, where it was just get in, stack them as high as you can, get people in, and there's no contract. If they don't pay, chuck them out and get on with it. It doesn't work like that. And it's active management, isn't it? So it's you are actively managing your own funds rather than it being passive. It's not passive income.
Yeah, okay. And therein lies the question, doesn't it? Can you sweat your capital greater than if you just parked it in a high interest savings account somewhere? I say the word high interest loosely because it's not particularly high, but we talk about deal analysis in other episodes and how you can work out, is it worth a hassle really, versus sticking it somewhere else. So yeah, great point.
Cool. So move on then to point number 6, which would be property type and lender criteria. You're aware generally what deposit you need and the costs available to you. What considerations need to go around property type and lender criteria?
So we've kind of touched upon some of this already. We've touched upon more the occupancy type as opposed to the property type, but both are relevant where it comes to the lender as well. We've also touched upon your personal circumstances and criteria. Now, as much as lenders will tell you that they can consider all these things, okay, they can. However, 80% of every deal is pretty binary, black and white, yes or no. Have you been a buy-to-let landlord for 12 months? Yes, no. If you're 11 months in, you will not pass go, and you have to wait the month to get to the 12 months, and then you can go. We referred to that about HMO and so on and so forth. So there are some specialist lenders that can take a view on some of this stuff, but it's very, very much prescribed, and we get criteria guides all the time, don't we, where it's just bullet points. This is our definition of that particular criteria point. Do they meet it? Yes or no? So, and this is where it comes back to us understanding your set of personal circumstances. Some of the property types to consider outside of just straightforward occupancy type is going to be blocks of flats. Okay, so you've got a buy-to-let. Now, a single AST on AST or operational contract, so a single occupant in one property. Okay, now a block of flats technically is just more of those in one unit, as it were. So let's say it's 6 flats. You'll have 6 different families living each in one of the flats, but that is a different property type that has a different barrier to entry. Okay, so it's considered more like, it's not quite a HMO, but obviously you're managing multiple tenancies in one property. You've got property above retail, above commercial rather. So if it's a flat above a shop, that's something to consider. You might be buying the flat and the shop. You might be buying the commercial. Commercial is a whole world of its own, which we probably should do an episode talking specifically around commercial. Some of the considerations there. So, and each lender will have their own criteria, not just for the occupancy, but for the property type and also for the borrower's set of circumstances that sits behind that as well. So a lot to consider when you also couple that with how many lenders are out there, X thousand or whatever the number is, you can now see how it can become quite the jungle out there, really, as to how do I get from A to B? I know what I want to do. How do I find the right lender? And also, how do I make sure that I'm paying the best rate and so on and so forth? I know that's kind of where we come in, but that's the sort of scenario that's what we've got to navigate when we're speaking with clients around how do we now fulfill or enable, I should say is the better word, how do we enable you to deliver against the strategy and the objectives that you've now set out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things is when people start looking for their first property deal, they generally start at the lower end of the market, which makes absolute sense. But what they will be doing is, if they spend a lot of time on Rightmove and a lot of time on Zoopla, and they're looking at the sort of gold mine area, the area that they're going to target at, because they've chosen their strategy, they know their goals. People who are doing this properly, they understand where they want to invest, what type of property they want. A 3-bed house in this location, terraced or semi in this sort of postcode, and then all of a sudden they find something that jumps out to them and goes, whoa, this is good value. And then they come to us and say, right, I found this deal. It's a modern method of auction, or it's in auction. Right, okay. Well, what is it about this property that's standing out? There's a reason why this is significantly cheaper than all of, it looks okay condition. So then there's a tenant in situ that hasn't got a contract. There may be a legal issue. There may be a subsidence issue. There's a number of things that could be a leasehold property with a short lease. There's a huge number of things that it could be, which has reduced the value of that property. It's not to say that issue or problem can't be solved. That's where investors come into their own. How do you solve those issues? The important thing for you as an investor is going, well, what's the cost to solve that issue compared to what I'm paying? And is there still merit in me doing it? I don't want to spend more money than the property's eventually going to be worth. So all of those little things of criteria, is it non-standard construction? Like you said, it could be a property opposite a pub. Some lenders are okay with that, others aren't. There's so many different things. So again, this is part of that deal analysis. And you're never going to know all of these things, even as brokers, like you said, there's so many lenders out there, there's so many different products out there that we don't always know, and if anyone says they know everything, then you're dealing with the wrong people, because it's just simply not true, and these lenders' criteria and options change from time to time as well. So that's that. Anything else on the property type or criteria?
I did have something, and my mind's kind of gone blank. But what was I going to say? Yeah. So on the property type, you mentioned something there around your criteria that you've set yourself, and again we refer back to how we've got to this point now in the conversation. It's like one of those things. When you are buying, you'll have your set of criteria. It could be a 3-bed, semi-detached. I want to put this type of occupant in there. This is because I know it'll command this rent. I know the purchase price is going to be this, and so on and so forth. That is a great base to start off on. I wouldn't then make it so rigid that you won't look anything outside slightly to the left or slightly to the right of that. It could be a 4-bed, but the 4th bed is like a box room, so it's not really a 4-bed. It could be $5,000 more than your budget, but the rental income jumps up incrementally such that the return on investment jumps up, or conversely the other way around, and so on. So set your boundary, if you like, but be prepared to look slightly left or right of that. I think is a great thing to do. And then also, it's that thing, isn't it? If you say yellow cars, you'll see loads of yellow cars. Once you start looking, you want to go and see lots of these different things to understand where the nuances sit in these property opportunities, because a 3-bed semi-detached on one street is quite different to the one on the next street, and the layout and all of this, there's bits that go within that. So I would just say the property type, you certainly want to have something in mind to meet your investment goals, but don't be so rigid that you literally won't look outside of that going forward. But you equally don't want to be so broad that everything sits in your investment goal, so there's a balance there. And the last one is then, don't be a motivated buyer. Okay, so I understand you've now set out your objectives, you can get a mortgage, X, Y, and Z. The first one you see, you're like, I found it, I'm going to get it, this is the one. It may not be. Just don't be a motivated buyer. You will probably end up paying more than you needed to. And look, these are lessons that you'll learn along the journey, right? But just be prepared to know that there will be another opportunity. If this one doesn't work, don't worry, be patient. The next one will come along at some point.
And that's one of the most difficult. And again, this was me 100% when I was buying my first property. I was getting itchy feet. You have to be patient. You have to be patient because you don't want to, buying a property that maybe needs some work and things is going to take up the next 6 or 12 months of your time. And you want to make sure that that's valuable time spent and not loss making time. So, do just spend that extra time and just be patient because there are plenty of deals out there. You just gotta bide that time. Yeah, excellent point. Okay, moving on to point 7 then, rental income and affordability tests. Depending on the property type, whether it buy-to-let, HMO or service accommodation, they're all kind of worked out differently. And in terms of the rental income, is it by room, is it per night, is it per week on a holiday let or service accommodation? There's lots of different ways to do it. Buy-to-let, obviously on a monthly basis. And also then tenant type will factor into that. Is it owned in your personal name or is it owned in a limited company? That will factor into the affordability assessment. So that there's a number of things. And as long as we've gone through this checklist, it will be a lot easier for us to have that conversation and give you clarity on what that affordability test would look like on the property. Ultimately, when people are looking to buy their first property and we have these conversations, like we said, it's in 2 parts, isn't it? Let's understand your goals and objectives and your circumstances. And then they say, what would the rate be on something like this? Well, it's much easier if you bring a deal to us. We can go through this deal analysis. So then we'll give you, because a property at 200,000 in one location with a rent of 750 compared to a property for 200,000 in another location with a rent at £1,200 a month, those affordability stress tests will be far different. So it's just understanding there are so many variables when it comes to assessing a deal. We need to just make sure that we go through all of them with you and that you fully understand the consequences of them.
Yeah, definitely. There's so with regards to this affordability, there's a formula ultimately that we use to work out whether something is affordable or not. So we're not talking about loan to value. That's a different metric. Okay, that is what percentage of the value of the property you can borrow. The next part of that equation is, does the rental income afford you to borrow up to the maximum LTV? So what we call high yielding properties invariably will. Properties in London where they're valued at $1 million, but they generated 1,500, I'm being extreme here, but they generate 1,500 a month. 1,500 is not going to support a loan of £750,000. It just doesn't work. So for the listeners on this, get yourselves a pen and paper or sort of you bookmark this. I'll just read to you I'll just shout out the actual equation that you use. Okay, so it's really, really simple. You take the annual rental income. So this doesn't matter whether it's commercial, single let, HMO. So their overall annual rental income. You divide that by the interest rate. Okay. For now, just for the purposes of your own example, use the interest rate that you think you're going to pay. Okay. You can have a look and we can guide you on that. And then you will divide that, if it's in a limited company, by 125%. If you are a basic rate taxpayer, you will divide it by 125%. If you're going to own it in your personal name at a higher rate taxpayer, you're going to divide it by 140%. Okay. That equation will spit out a number, and that number is the maximum amount you can borrow based on the rental income, the interest rate, and the ratio that I just use, a 140 or 125%. Okay. Now, if that number exceeds 75% loan to value, then you can borrow the 75% loan to value. If that number is under the 75% loan to value, then that number is the maximum you can borrow, not the LTV. Okay, so that equation works in everything except service accommodation, where the formula is quite different. Okay, so the reason I share that is back a fag packet. I hate that phrase, but if you want to do a quick calculation as to whether this is likely to stack up in terms of a mortgage, annual rent divided by the interest rate divided by that ratio, 125% or 140%, and that number will tell you whether that works or not.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's just there's so many different calculations and percentages and figures. It's easy to get lost with this stuff. So, really learning this stuff as part of before you get started will make your journey a lot simpler. Absolutely. And then probably the point 8 then is around mortgage product choices, which will factor into point 7 as well. What is the pay rate? If you're going for a 5-year fixed rate, what was the pay rate used for that calculation? If you do go for a 2-year fixed rate with a lot of lenders, then it will alter that calculation. So again, we can break that down in more detail. We have recently done an episode. There's so many mortgages. So we're talking about hundreds of lenders, and each lender has hundreds of products. So we're talking about thousands of mortgage products at different loan to values for different product types. And then we just use it on a recent episode. We just used an example of 75% limited company, straightforward buy to let, and there were 4 different products just at for that option, which included a no arrangement fee from the lender, 2 different fixed fees from the lender, and a percentage fee. So there's just so many options. So trying to navigate that again becomes a headache on its own. And this is why you need to get advice from a professional, whether that's us or somebody else who knows what they're talking about, and looking at those products. And then you need to make a decision as what's the best for you from a cash flow perspective, what's the best for you from a long-term cost perspective, and just understanding the dynamics of how that works. But this is getting more now into the nitty-gritty once you've had, when you're doing your deal analysis, and then eventually once you've had your offer accepted on choosing that product that you want to go for.
Definitely. I'd also point listeners as well to the website, primeproperty.finance, where you can find the other podcasts. But there's also a calculator section in there as well that we've put together. So it's a free resource. Just log in, and there's loads of calculators on there. There's mortgage calculators, there's HMO affordability calculators. So all of the stuff we're talking about now, you don't need to know it inside out. That's our job. But we provided you a ton of resource off the back of that as well for you to have a play around. Talking of the different rate types. So you mentioned there the 5-year, 2-year fixed. You've got discount rates, which are usually a discount off the bank standard variable rates. You've got tracker rates, which are a percentage above the Bank of England base rate. There are still those people out there who've got it 0.5% or 0.25% above base and all that sort of stuff. So, there's that to consider. One of and that would be largely driven by what the market looks like at the time. Okay, and then, as you say, whether you want a cash flow or whether actually cash flow doesn't matter and these sorts of things. I suppose the more important question in my mind is what repayment type are you going to be looking for? Are you looking to do interest only, which is extremely popular with investors? Or you're looking to do capital and interest, which ultimately will pay down the loan over time? And again, there are pros and cons to both options. One might just be personal preference. Your attitude to risk is such that I do not want mortgages by the time I'm retired, because this is an investment nest egg for me. I do not want mortgages by the time I'm there, and I want the freedom to do whatever. That is a personal choice, not a number-orientated one for whatever reason. Then we've got the option of keeping it interest only. There are benefits to doing that. When you want to hand your estate over, you only pay inheritance tax on equity, not on the total value. So paying down debt from an IHT perspective doesn't always make sense. Again, we're moving into the realms of estate planning there, so that's something to consider. People want interest only because they want the cash flow, as you say, the monthly payments are smaller. Therefore, the net income on a monthly basis is greater than if you were to do capital and interest. There can be age factors that will determine whether someone wants to do interest only or capital and interest off the back of it. So lots of different reasons why people would choose one versus the other. I guess my point here is there's no right answer. It's very much dependent on what your preferences are and your set of circumstances and your objectives are.
Absolutely. So I think that's pretty much it. And again, we've gone into some of these points around mortgage rates and types and different choices that you can make on different deals. So we've gone into those on other episodes. Again, we're just trying to highlight things to consider. So that's pretty much it from a deal analysis point of view. So then we kind of move on to the last section, and that would be, so point 9 for us is around protection and risk management. So and having a cash buffer. So we did talk a bit about at the beginning, obviously personal circumstances, how much cash have you got? And people will say, right, I've got 50 grand that I've got to put into this deal. And what they'll do is they'll go, right, I need 25% deposit, I've got stamp duty, I've got my refurb and thing. And they will use up the whole of that 50K and then leave themselves with nothing in the bank. And what we really want to make sure of is that you do keep something back from a cash buffer perspective. Things do go wrong. And so just making sure that, a tenant doesn't pay, there's flood damage, there's issues with the properties, you've got any major repairs, boilers go and things like that. You have to maintain the properties. So having some sort of cash buffer is super, super important. And then just long-term, risk management and protection. Ultimately, if you take out a mortgage on a property, you are going to want to have some life insurance so that if you were to pass away, that mortgage would be paid off. And so factoring in the cost of the insurance, landlord's insurance, if the property has a fire, flood or whatever it may be, there's buildings at landlord's insurance that you need to have. So making sure that you factor that into your sort of deal analysis. So that goes back to some of those costs. But ultimately, you are going to spend a lot of time and effort building a portfolio. You really need to consider early on what happens to that portfolio if something happens to you. There's a huge amount of change going on now with inheritance tax. Is very popular at the moment. So people who have, this is probably more for people who already have portfolios and thinking about their inheritance tax liabilities. But that's another conversation. But as you set out to think about buying, your first property, is making sure that you are adequately protected, so that, because people think, well, if I die, someone, they'll just sell the property and that would be it. Whereas actually that's not necessarily the case. If you die and it's just you that owns the property, then the lender is going to want their money back. So they're going to call in the loan. If your family has no interest in property whilst you're alive, the chances of them having any interest in property whilst you're dead, well, obviously, you'd like to think they'd be grieving at that point. But, jokes aside, they're not going to want to, they don't know how to deal with property. They're not going to want to deal with it. So the fact that they then have to try and sell this property to pay back the lender means that they may have to sell that, as a fire sale. It might have to be done. If there's a tenant in there already, they'd have to get rid of the tenant. It's a lot more difficult to get for no fault evictions now to get rid of tenants. So you might have to put that property at auction to sell it with a tenant in situ. There's only a certain type of buyer that would want to buy a property with a tenant in situ. And they would want a discount for that. So all of these things come into it, in which case you might not end up with anything at all, even you potentially at a loss, So you can very, very easily set up an insurance policy so that if you die, the mortgage is paid off. Whoever's you're leaving that property to can just deal with it further down the line without the headache of having to try and remortgage, incur further costs, or sell the property and incur costs, and just collect the rent, from an unmortgaged property and just collect the rent, and actually have an asset that is an asset and not a headache or a liability.
Yeah, and I think, and these are all relevant points, because the conversation invariably with people who've got, a reasonable sized portfolio is, all my values in my portfolio, I don't need to protect, and so on and so forth. And I get it. I totally understand where that mindset comes from. And I'm not saying it's wrong at all either. That's just their own thoughts on the matter. I think a lot of people underestimate or misunderstand mortgages on property in this type of scenario. So I think it's probably well expected that if you own the property in your personal name and you're going to inherit it, okay, and there is no money to pay off the mortgage, you're going to have to do something about that mortgage. You're either going to have to sell the property to pay off the mortgage, or you're going to have to get your own mortgage to pay off that mortgage to get that one. That is pretty hopefully evident if it's in your personal name. But the same is true in a limited company. So I'm going to build this portfolio. It's in limited company. It's not an issue. The limited company is the borrower. In the same conversation we had around, well, Mark, why does my personal circumstances affect the mortgage? If you change the ownership of that company in any way, shape or form, you have to get new mortgages. So there's a cost implication to that, because you're not just going to speak to the lender and go, can you just transfer into my name? the answer is no, you need to reapply for all of these mortgages. So, in which case you now need to get them all revalued. You may have had to do that as part of the estate, but you will have to get them revalued as part of the mortgages anyway. You'll have to pay new arrangement fees on all the mortgages. You'll have to go through the rigmarole of applying for all these mortgages, especially if you've got a large portfolio at this juncture. There's a lot of work. So whilst you have built this portfolio and it's for my children after my days and so on, which is great, actually, are you aware of what you're actually passing over and what it actually means to them? And actually, you could be passing them over more problems than solutions at this stage when they're already, as you say, grieving, and it's already a stressful time. And now they've got to go and sort out 10 mortgages. Whereas insurance policy, written in trust, will just pay it all off. And then that portfolio can hand seamlessly across to children. And it's up to them if they want to get mortgages and continue the journey. They've got a real injection of capital, life-changing sums of money at this point. This is generational wealth that we're talking about now, which is what a lot of people get into property for as well. And it's a much cleaner, probably less stressful way to do that and be able to hand that property over if anything should happen to you.
Yeah, and obviously depending on the setup, potentially you can offset the cost of that insurance policy against your tax as well, depending on the circumstances. Okay, cool. So let's kind of wrap it up then. Point 10 on this journey of list of top 10 things to consider before buying your first investment property would be, are you prepared? So, the dream and the reality of investing, ultimately we have mentioned it already. The dream is it's get rich quick, it's easy, it's passive, you make a ton of money without any headaches. And I guess the reality is something very different. We've touched on some of those. It isn't get rich quick. Can you get rich from property? You can become wealthy over time. But you speak to any honest investor who's built a portfolio, it's not been easy. There's been more downs than there has ups, because you're always on to the next thing that needs to be done. You're always on to the next refurb. You're always on to the next tenant issue or court case or whatever it may be that you've got to contend with at that moment in time. One thing it does do is it builds resilience. You need to have lots of resilience. You need patience. You need thick skin as well. And ultimately, you need to take a long-term view. It isn't, like you said, it's things that happen. Property values go up over time. There are obviously peaks and troughs in the short term, but over time, over history, property prices have doubled every 10 years. Whether that's going to continue, who knows? But in the UK, we're a small island with a increase in population. So the the supply of housing isn't meeting demand. We heard this government say they're going to build. And actually at this moment in time, they haven't done that. And planning applications are at a record low, or planning approvals are a record low. So it's just not happening. And so what does that mean? More demand, that will just keep pushing property prices up. It'll keep pushing rents up because of the lack of supply of rents. With more people coming into the country than are leaving, private rented sector rents are going to continue to grow. So over time, it is still a solid investment strategy. However, the making sure that you're up to date with all the regulations, the rule changes that are coming in. Some have already come in. The energy performance, MEES, the minimum efficiency energy standards that's coming in as well, and the cost implications of those when you're looking at properties. There are so many things. So, before you even buy your first property, the purpose of this is, are you prepared? There's so much information out there, as you mentioned earlier, but it's being clear on what your plans and goals are, your objectives, and what education can you get within that. There's so many things you can read. There's so many podcasts, there's YouTube, there's courses, and sometimes there can be information overload, isn't it? That's the point. I think you've just got to really spend some time. For me, it's spending the time really being focused on where you want to get to, and then working backwards on how are you going to get there? How are you going to get there? Right? Why do I want to get there? And then what strategy, what skills have I got? What income do I need? What capital do I need? And just keep working that plan backwards until you get to the point of go, right, I need to go and find a 6-bed HMO in this city for students. Or it might be, I want to go and find, a block of 10 flats or whatever it may be, or a simple buy-to-let in this location at this price point, and you've really nailed it down, so you're really clear on where you're going.
Absolutely. I think, let's take someone who's in the mid-30s, early to mid-30s, so 35, because I can do the maths easier that way. They're 35 years of age. They're sensibly looking at their future. Yeah. Many people who get into property investment of some description are ultimately playing the long game anyway. Okay. And that's been hard done. So it starts with an idea. I'm going to go and invest in a couple of buy-to-lets. I know we're going to need 4, et cetera, and it's for my retirement. Okay. By that very nature of that conversation, retirement age, typically for a male, 65 years of age, 66, that's state pension age, but usually retiring out of work, 60 to 65. The word retirement means that you're going to get to 60. So there's already 25 years in this equation. Plus, you're not going to sell it when you retire because you need the income forever. So, average lifespan is 77, I think, possibly 80. So you're in this game now for, what's that? I said I could do the math season. I can't actually. So it's 45 years. Yeah. So you're in this game for 45 years. Are you prepared to be in this game for 45 years is ultimately the question. And it is long term. Look, you may end up with, I think the average tenancy is 5 years, just under 5 years, 4.8 years. So you're going to go through, if you have a perfect tenancy every time, you're going to go through 5, what's that? Yes, 5, 45, 8, 9. You're going to go through 9 different tenancies, which equally present their own sets of challenges and so on and so forth. So this isn't designed to put people off by any stretch of imagination. All it is to shine a light on, actually, it's a great idea right now. You turn that idea into fruition by securing the property. And then if you want to achieve your objective, you need to be committed to the path and knowing that path will have its challenges along the way, as well as the rewards, hopefully, it brings when you do want to rely on that income to subsidize your pension and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think it's, we just talked about, and we aren't, and we are it's very easy to get caught up in the sex appeal of being a landlord, and people think it's a get rich quick. The reason they think that is because landlords and investors get hammered by the government, and they're an easy target from a taxation point of view. And there's plenty of rhetoric that goes around the buy-to-let is dead, and it has become a lot more challenging. There's no doubt about that. But those people who have a clear goal and plan and are happy to be in it for the long term will get benefit out of it. And so, they're just, what we are doing is we're trying to be realistic and raise, we don't want to get caught up in all we want to just bring it back down to earth. Let's see, right, what are the things to focus on? And this, again, is having this conversation in depth now and really trying to educate people around the realities and things to consider, so that when they come on to work with us, that journey, they fully expect in what that journey looks like, and things and they should have considered at least some of these things. That's ultimately the point. And again, like we said earlier, you're never going to get it right. And even myself, my investing strategy has changed over time because of the change in the market, change in my ambitions and various things. So things will change. It's just making sure that you've got the foundational knowledge and the foundational structure in place based on your circumstances.
Yeah, it's just ultimately about going into this with your eyes wide open. It's not the shiny penny people make it out to be, but equally, it's not the end of the world either. And it's not dead as an industry and all of that sort of stuff. So be informed, be educated, avoid analysis paralysis, because you can be over-informed and you could you could talk yourself out of things. So I think the word of this podcast is ultimately going to come back to considered action. So take action, but just do it with your eyes wide open. Be considered in your approach to whatever you're doing. And look, there will be some bumps on the way. That's the nature of the beast. Hopefully there's lessons to pick out of that as you go through your journey to avoid making those mistakes again. And if you stick with it and you follow the plan and commit to the process, there's no reason why you can't achieve the objectives that you set out when you initially started.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to finish off then, one of the things that we've talked about in the past, and we try and remind people from our perspective, is that you want the 3 C's of investing, and that's invest with clarity, with confidence, and with credibility. So clarity of knowing what you're trying to do and where you're going, the confidence in your deal analysis and understanding the numbers, and then your credibility when it comes to presenting yourself to lenders, to estate agents, to vendors, and investors potentially, depending on what you're doing. So when you look at that as a whole, you're becoming a great investor, which is ultimately what you want to be. You'd rather be a good investor than a bad one. So if you can try and nail all of those points, then you'll make the game a lot easier for yourself.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, look, Mark, great catching up again on what we think is a really, really valuable topic. We'll see you on the next episode.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. 2-part series because of the length of it and the detail that we dived into. We really hope you enjoyed. And if you did, then please we'd love it if you could share the episode with any friends, family, or people that you've met in networking who are trying to learn more about property investing and how it works and the financing elements. And, always remember to invest with clarity, confidence, and credibility, which hopefully has been a big takeaway from this episode. So thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. If you could give us a review, we'd really value that. It makes a huge difference to us on a new podcast. If you could share it with everyone that you can and put it on your social media, we'd really, really be grateful for it. It costs us a lot of money to put this together, and we'd love to get this in front of as many listeners as possible. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.